Hello again, I'm Russ Williams, and this is the instructional video for the strategy called The More Things Change.
So the strategy, the more things change, is, well, based on the namesake, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Or probably a little more accurately, when you're looking at history, the more things change, the more some things stay the same. Another way I like to put it is, if you truly believe history repeats itself, then prove it. So the essential skill here that we want to build for our history students is the skill of continuity and change over time. This is really, I guess, what you would call big picture history. Sometimes it's difficult to do this strategy if you haven't covered enough material. This is almost like a flyover, maybe over an entire unit. Sometimes it looks at multiple units of your curriculum. So let's first kind of fast forward and see why this skill is so important, and hopefully you'll then see why the strategy is so needed. So down the road, a lot of your students will sit for AP exams, and the AP exams, especially the LEQs, the long essay questions, I mean, they'll have this skill tested in other areas, even in multiple choice, but from time to time they'll get LEQs that really concentrate on the concept of continuity and change over time, or the historical thinking skill. Here's some examples of some questions that we've seen from U.S. history. Evaluate the extent to which technology fostered change in the United States industry. In United States industry from 1865 to 1900. The first thing that students should do is look at the time frame. Okay, go ahead and find the bookends, so to speak. Beginning with 1865, we're ending with 1900. So within that span of time, in this case 35 years, what are now the trends that we see, the trends in both continuities and in changes? Even though this question just says change, the good essay response is going to differentiate between the changes and what actually stays the same, what actually continues in the period. All right. So don't let that throw you, or students should learn as quickly as possible that whenever they say the word change, it's a good idea to also mention some continuities. So evaluate the extent to which new technology fostered change in the United States industry from 1865 to 1900. All right. The focus here is on technology and change. All right. But again, this is under the thinking skill of continuity and change. So they would need to mention what will actually stay the same to get, to improve their chances of getting full credit here. Then we have a example from world history. Describe and explain a significant continuity and a significant change. So this question is more specific. It's more clear that they're looking for both. Okay, kind of implied up here. I've seen plenty of U.S. questions that were worded more like this, where it was specifically looking for the continuity and the change. In this case, in the global balance of political power in the period 1900 to the present. So looking at 100 plus years, the last 100, roughly 120 years of history. Look for continuities and changes. Notice global balance of political power. So that's the lens, that's the historical theme. That's kind of the area that we want to focus on, or the students want to focus on. They want to look at it. The skill is continuity and change. The focus is political continuities and changes. and of course the time period 1900 to the present. All right, so those are the questions they're going to get in AP, and in many instances, again, so the years that I taught AP, it was the LEQ was the last question they typically answered, and some were struggling to get anything down on paper. A lot of them did well on the DBQ; they did well enough on the multiple choice, but sometimes they would lose it with the LEQ. It, as I put here, it sometimes, and in many instances, it's when they receive that dreaded 2 instead of that passing 3, or sometimes 4 for some universities. They were unable to demonstrate the knowledge of continuity and change over time. And that was the cause. That was the problem. So what we want to do with 6th graders, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th graders, we want to address this historical thinking skill early and often. So the more you can find ways to implement this strategy, again, it might not be every unit, but we beg you to please find multiple occasions throughout the semester to come back to this strategy, because they really need to develop this skill to succeed, again, at the higher level. So if you have plenty of students that are not going to sit for an AP exam, the skill still raises the bar in critical thinking and analytical skills, while enhancing their ability to understand how and why we change, how and why we stay the same, and how they can become rational decision makers and informed citizens with this understanding. All right. So that's the goal. Even if they're not going to sit for an AP exam, we really need to develop this skill, this ability for students to make better decisions, to be better citizens, to be more rational. Because again, we know that they're going to have all these conflicting sources. I mean, they get it every time they turn on their cell phone, all these conflicting sources of often false information. So they have to be able to decipher truth from propaganda. And so this skill really enhances their ability to look at the scope of human history, where we've been and what strides we've really made, maybe where we keep going around in the same circle and making the same mistakes, history repeating itself, or where we've made gains and how we made those gains, why we made those gains. And maybe we can learn something, or they can learn something from that. And again, as a generation, take this country to the next level and make the necessary improvements. All right, so here's an example we like to use. Okay, and you can tell what generation I'm from here. I'm going to use Tom Hanks and his movie career as an example. And I'm sorry if I left a few of the good ones out, but if you look at the movie career of Tom Hanks, and you go back to the old days of Splash and Big, and then you just kind of follow the timeline of his, and sorry, this kind of goes up and down like that, so I didn't even know he was in a movie called He Knows You're Alone, I guess a thriller of some sort. But as you look at the movie career, ask yourself, what remains the same? What continues? What are the continuities in the movie career of Tom Hanks? And you may notice that, well, he's, in most cases, at least the movies I've seen, again, I've never seen this first one here, but in most cases he's the good guy, but he's kind of the average Joe that everyone kind of relates to, and I guess that's why we always root for Tom Hanks, or we feel like we can relate to Tom Hanks. He's not all powerful, and he makes mistakes just like we do, but he is that very relatable character that again we pull for. So yeah, you see those throughout these films, or throughout most of these films. So then you step back and say, okay, well, what changes if there is a clear actor that resonates time and time again, usually for the same qualities. What changes in his career? And you may notice that, okay, well, other than this film, he had a lot of comedies early on, some romantic comedies, and then things get a lot more serious, especially in the 90s. For his career, things got a lot more serious. He started playing more historical characters, recreating these real life, again, very, very humanistic, dramas. Um, and so I guess the next thing we want to ask is, okay, where does the shift occur? If a major change or a major shift occurs in his career, where is it at? Is it somewhere around Forrest Gump? Is it Apollo 13? Philadelphia was the first one that, of course, receives the Academy Award recognition, and where he kind of establishes himself as a serious actor. So maybe that's the movie that really changed his career. I kind of joke that maybe after Sleepless in Seattle that was he didn't want to be the romantic comedy guy, so he wanted to go down take the serious path. So that's a simple enough approach. So let's say your students aren't exactly up on the film career of Tom Hanks. Here's a good generic example that you can use to introduce the strategy to students for the first time. And what we've come to discover in several trainings we've done in the past is that teachers like to do this the first week of school. They see this as a good way to not just introduce a strategy that they're later going to use with the actual historical content, but it's a good way for them to get to know their students a little better. So here's the strategy, or here's the example. Instead of looking at historical timeline, have the students, second day of school, third day of school, whenever appropriate, have them draft their own timeline, noting some of the major events that have occurred in their lifetime, the 13, 14, 15 years, whatever, of their lives. And after they, create the timeline of those major events, then ask them to start looking for the continuities and changes. What has remained the same? And students, you make this personal. You let them write on their own paper and tell them just to share what they feel comfortable sharing. But teachers have talked about how much they learn about their students early in the year by doing this. They learn, how they get a better idea how stable the home environment has been, if the student has had multiple living arrangements, maybe has bounced around from to different parents or even grandparents. The student might have the whole time been doing some kind of, especially if you have them in high school, maybe they've been working for a couple of years. You find out maybe what their interests are. A lot of them will just share things like they've been playing sports since they were 5 years old or whatever. And you also will see some of those important shifts, some of those important changes that have occurred. It could be going from elementary to middle school. It could be when they didn't make All-Star team or honor roll or something, and how it was just this traumatic event in their life. That's oftentimes they'll identify those traumatic events as the change. It changed something about them, or or maybe it was a really good event that made them who they were. But you can look at their life and say, even within your short life, you've gone through some continuities and some major changes. What are those? And then when those changes occurred, why did they occur? What was the cause of that major shift in your life? So here's the actual strategy. Here's what they're going to do. Of course, you provide, whatever the source is. And again, it might just be a chapter in a textbook, and it might be a number of, it could be a series of study guides, again, from multiple units. It could be a long article, summary over covering multiple decades, whatever. So students will pick out some of those key moments. You could even give them just a bigger timeline and have them condense it down to their own timeline, okay? So that's the first thing. They're going to come up with a timeline of major events. So here's a historical example I decided to use for you. Let's look at the Progressive Era, United States, from 1890 to 1920. So approaching the Progressive Era from the standpoint of, okay, what's going to continue and what's going to change and what's going to ultimately cause those changes or those major shifts. So we would want to look for something, of course, on the earlier end of the timeline. So you go back to the beginning of 1890, even though I guess you could say 1889 was Hull House. Maybe it should begin in 1889, but we like even numbers, so here you go. 1890, Jacob Riis publishes How the Other Half Lives. That was a pretty important moment, one of the early muckraking moments. You've got in 1896, you have Dewey's Progressive School. You have, of course, Theodore Roosevelt coming into office. They're replacing the assassinated President McKinley, and so by 1902 you see his trust-busting campaign emerge. In 1906 you see the Hepburn Act, you see the Pure Food and Drug Act, you see the Meat Inspection Act, so a lot of consumer activism. 1909 you have the establishment of the NAACP. 1911, you have the antitrust case that's going to ultimately break up Standard Oil. 1914, you got the creation of the Federal Trade Commission and the Clayton Antitrust Act. And then, of course, by the end of the period, we're now looking, of course, I've skipped a lot. We know that there's a lot more events to chart, but I just picked out some here. Of course, have Prohibition, and then, of course, women's suffrage in 1920 to kind of end the movement. So if the students were just going to chart, the timeline of events, the next thing you want them to do down here for this, where it says annotation date and the explanation, is pick out some of the major ones that really stand out, or where they think that they're seeing some trends, where they think that maybe they're seeing some things that are continuous, or they're seeing major shifts, major changes occur. So, they're probably going to pick out something from when it began, because we call this the progressive, 3 decades for a reason, beginning in 1890, because 1890 is a pretty, important, year. So in the muckraking and exposing the slum living in New York, this national audience finally begins to look more at the issues of poverty and how so many of the American people were living. Maybe they'll choose 1902 as a big one, because you have this idea that maybe the government is becoming more accountable through the Roosevelt administration, becoming more accountable to the people over the corporations. 1906, what's big about this? Well, there's several things that are passed, so maybe the explanation would be, okay, well, there's obviously some pro-consumer legislation. There's a greater concern for public health. Maybe this is a direct correlation to Upton Sinclair's The Jungle that was published right before this. Maybe Roosevelt found a lot of popularity in 1902 with the stance that he was taking, and decided to really become that progressive president that he, enjoyed taking on, the powers that be of the time. And of course, we can say that 1919 is this sign that the country is concerned about moral legislation and battling things like domestic violence, sin, and poverty. In the 1920, we see that through women's suffrage that the progressive reformers that led so many of these led the movement and led into the success of so many of these reforms. The women, they were finally given the right to vote after being, again, the kind of the active voices and protesters and the catalyst of the progressive movement. So the second page, page 2 of the template, is where they begin to kind of break it down. All right, so after they've looked at the timeline, they've picked out some of those key years and provided some explanations. then we're going to have them take this ESPN approach of, okay, well, what are the economic, social, political, and environmental, how do we organize? And again, some of these boxes will be left blank because the evidence might not be there. There might not be an economic continuity. Obviously, there is in this example, but it may not be the case. So, what are the continuities you picked up on? What are the changes? They might have something like this. From a continuity standpoint, poverty continued, even though there's this awareness campaign that the other half lives this way, and so many of the issues are about people that are struggling in the progressive era. Poverty is not going to be solved. It's not going to be resolved. From a social standpoint, you have this continuity. Women have led the wave of reform throughout the movement, as mentioned moments ago. Is that so many of the reform efforts were led by women, and that was just a social continuity throughout this period. Here's something else that you could pull out from a social standpoint. Racial inequality saw little progress. You have the establishment of the NAACP, but that's one area, in terms of race relations, it's one area that we don't really see a lot of progress. Instead, we actually, we see Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. So Jim Crow is firmly supported in the South, and things are not, much better in the Midwest and even in the North for African Americans at this time. So racial inequality is not really an area that we would say that a lot of things improved. I mean, you have your Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois, you have, of course, kind of that debate going on, and you have, I guess you could say, some economic progress, but from a social standpoint, it's not a major change from where we've been. Sometimes it's more difficult to pick out the continuities, because we sometimes can't see the consistent trends. We can see the changes are usually easier because they kind of jump out. Oh, this is new, this is different. But this kind of steady continuity often is very difficult to find. Moving right along here, then we have other things like economically, trust decline, fair prices, and more international competition due to lower tariffs. Those are economic changes. Prohibition is a social change. Government activism on behalf of the workers and consumers is a political change. We didn't really look at it, but of course, from an environmental standpoint, we know about Teddy Roosevelt and his love for nature, and you have the conservation and the preservation movements. So yeah, we're seeing a lot of changes. So we have fewer continuities, it would seem, than changes, at least from the information we looked at. And so given this table, the student should then be able to come up with a good thesis, a good claim. And we even, have prompted them here, given them, kind of led them here with, the blank led to changes in blank that helped improve blank. However, little change regarding blank and blank continued. So again, they can then just pull things from the chart. One other thing I do want to mention, make sure they do this thesis. This could be just an exit ticket. That would be a great way to use this. It's very important they get the claim, very important they get the thesis done. And notice it's kind of, instead of doing the thesis first, we're working, and ultimately building a thesis, a good one that we can put a lot of evidence into or to support at the end. But do want to mention that this would be a great strategy to review for a 9 weeks exam, a semester exam. Okay, even if you just gave them a discussion question, and this was the strategy, or even kind of the study guide to prepare them for that discussion question or short essay or whatever. Like I said, you're going to have to cover some ground before it's time to use it, but we encourage you. It'd be great if you could use it 2 or 3 times in 9 weeks at least. Hopefully they could see it a couple times a semester, just to see the big picture unfold and start thinking in terms of, okay, in this big block of time, what is really changing and what's causing those changes, and ultimately what's history repeating itself over and over again. What have we not been able, what problems have we not been able to solve or address, and why? Why do they remain continuities? Thanks, and I hope this helps.